I never thought I'd end up here, staring at the cold, gray walls of Redwood Penitentiary, a maximum security prison nestled deep in the forests of Northern California. Life has a twisted sense of humor, I suppose. One moment, you're a respected engineer with a loving family. The next, you're inmate number 74629, convicted of a crime you didn't commit. It all started 2 years ago. I was working as a structural engineer for a prominent construction firm, overseeing projects that shaped the skyline. My wife, Emily, and our daughter, Sophie, were my world. But that world crumbled when I was accused of embezzling millions from the company. The evidence was damning. Forged documents, falsified accounts, all pointing to me. Despite my pleas of innocence, the jury saw what they wanted to see, a man driven by greed. I was sentenced to 25 years without parole. Prison life is a different universe. The rules are unspoken, but clear. Trust no one. Show no weakness. Every day is a battle for survival, not just physically, but mentally. The guards wield their power with an iron fist, and the inmates, well, let's just say alliances are fragile, and betrayal is a currency. I spent the first year in a haze, grappling with the injustice of it all. But despair is a luxury I couldn't afford. I had to adapt to find a way to endure. I kept to myself, observing, learning the rhythms of the prison. My background in engineering became both a blessing and a curse. The guard saw me as a potential asset for maintenance work, granting me access to areas other inmates couldn't reach. But it also made me a target. Knowledge is power, and power is dangerous here. One evening, as I was fixing a broken pipe in the East Wing, I overheard a conversation between two guards. They spoke of a structural vulnerability in the prison's design, a maintenance tunnel that hadn't been used in decades, leading from the boiler room to an old sewage system beyond the prison walls. My engineer's mind began to race. Could this be a way out? I dismissed the thought immediately. Escaping Redwood was suicide. The surrounding forests were dense and unforgiving, and the prison's reputation for recapturing escapees was near perfect. But once the seed of an idea is planted, it grows, festering in the back of your mind. Days turned into weeks, and the monotony of prison life pressed down on me. I received letters from Emily, filled with words of love and support, but I could read between the lines. She was struggling, raising Sophie alone, fighting to make ends meet. The thought of them suffering because of a crime I didn't commit was unbearable. That's when I made the decision. I would escape, not just for me, but for them. I had the skills, the knowledge, and now a possible route. But I couldn't do it alone. I needed allies, people I could trust, a rare commodity in this place. I started with Marcus, a former electrician serving time for armed robbery. We had crossed paths during maintenance duties, and I knew he had the technical skills needed to navigate the electrical systems. Next was Luis, a mechanic with a knack for machinery and a calm demeanor that belied his strength. Lastly, there was Darnell, a chemist who had fallen into the world of illicit substances. His knowledge of chemicals could be invaluable. Approaching them was a risk. If they refused or, worse, reported me, I'd be thrown into solitary or worse. But desperation breeds courage. One by one, I sounded them out, hinting at the possibility of freedom. Their reactions were cautious but intrigued. Each had their own reasons for wanting out, their own stories of loss and injustice. We formed a pact, an unspoken agreement bound by the shared desire for freedom. The first step was gathering information. We needed to know the exact layout of the prison, the guard rotations, the security measures in place. This meant observation and patience. Marcus managed to secure access to the prison's outdated electrical schematics, noting the locations of cameras and alarm systems. Luis observed the guards, noting their routines, their habits, and, most importantly, their weaknesses. Darnell focused on procuring materials, chemicals from the infirmary, tools from the workshops, anything that could aid our escape. Weeks turned into months as we meticulously planned, each detail scrutinized and debated. We knew the risks. Failure meant death, or at the very least, a lifetime in solitary confinement. But the thought of freedom, of seeing our loved ones again, drove us forward. The plan was simple in theory, but complex in execution. We would access the maintenance tunnel during the night shift when the prison was at its quietest. Marcus would disable the electrical systems, causing a temporary blackout. In the darkness, we would make our way to the boiler room, access the tunnel, and navigate through the old sewage system to the forest beyond. But simplicity is deceptive. We had to account for countless variables: unexpected patrols, malfunctioning equipment, the physical toll of crawling through a decades-old tunnel. And then there was the moral dilemma. To succeed, we might have to neutralize the guards, men who were just doing their jobs. Could we cross that line? As the day of the escape approached, tension hung heavy in the air. We moved like shadows, each action deliberate, each word measured. There was no room for error, no margin for doubt. On the eve of our planned escape, a storm rolled in, dark clouds swallowing the moonlight. It was as if nature itself was conspiring with us, offering the cover of darkness. We gathered in the dimly lit corner of the workshop, finalizing our plans, steeling ourselves for what lay ahead. Failure was not an option. For me, for Emily, for Sophie, I had to succeed. I had to reclaim the life that was stolen from me, no matter the cost. The night before the escape, none of us slept. Not really. We lay in our bunks, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the fluorescent lights, the occasional cough of another inmate, the distant sound of boots on concrete. Everything felt amplified, as if the walls themselves knew what we were about to do. The storm had rolled in, thick and heavy, drumming against the roof of the cell block. Perfect cover. No one would hear the small sounds of our movements, the scraping of metal, the click of locks. The rain would wash away footprints, obscure the distant tree line where we would vanish. If we made it that far, at 2 a.m., it was time. The guards changed shifts in staggered rotations, a flaw in their routine that we had studied for weeks. At exactly 2:05, the security office would be at its most vulnerable, one guard monitoring the cameras, another making a lap around the administrative wing, and the third grabbing coffee from the break room. 5 minutes. That was our window. Marcus was the key to everything. If he didn't cut the power in time, the whole plan fell apart before it even started. I sat up in my bunk, feet hitting the cold floor. Across from me, Luis nodded once. Darnell took a slow breath, muttering something under his breath. A prayer, maybe. He was the least outwardly violent of us, but I knew he had accepted the reality of what might come next. The boiler room key was already in my pocket, a small stolen prize from weeks ago when I had been sent to fix a pipe. That was the first step. The second? Getting out of the block without anyone noticing. Marcus moved first, slipping out of his bunk and into the corridor. He had the easiest job, but the most pressure: get to the electrical panel, overload the circuits, and kill the lights. We didn't need long. Just a few minutes of total darkness. I glanced at Luis and Darnell. Time to move. We slid out into the hallway, moving like ghosts. The night guard, Reynolds, was sitting at his post, half asleep, a paperback novel open in his lap. Predictable. His routine never changed. Read a few chapters, take a piss, and then do his rounds. We needed him to take that bathroom break now. Darnell reached into his pocket and pulled out a small makeshift gas canister. A mix of chemicals swiped from the infirmary. Nothing lethal, but enough to make a man violently sick for a few minutes. He flicked the cap, gave me a final glance, and tossed it toward Reynolds' chair. A soft hiss filled the air. A second later, Reynolds gagged, clutching his stomach. Jesus, he groaned, pushing himself up. He took 2 staggering steps before bolting toward the restroom. I didn't wait. We slipped past his desk and moved toward the maintenance access door. Then, blackness. Marcus had done his job. The lights died, the hum of electricity vanishing in an instant. The storm outside roared louder now, the wind howling through the vents. I fumbled for the stolen key, found the lock, twisted. Click. We were in. The door swung shut behind us, sealing us inside the maintenance corridor. No turning back now. The tunnel ahead of us stretched downward, sloping toward the lower levels of the prison. It was narrow, the concrete damp from years of leaking pipes. We moved fast but careful. One wrong noise, and we were finished. In the distance, we could hear voices, guards shouting, confused, trying to reset the power. The blackout had caught them off guard, but we had minutes at best before they switched to backup generators. The air grew hotter as we neared the boiler room, the pipes radiating heat even in the dead of night. The main floor was empty. Most of the staff only worked during the day. The old metal door leading to the forgotten maintenance tunnel was ahead, just like the schematics had shown. Luis took out the bolt cutters, moving fast. He clamped the jaws around the rusted padlock and squeezed. The metal groaned, resisted, then snapped. We pulled the door open, revealing darkness beyond darkness. The tunnel was worse than I expected. Narrow, damp, the smell of mold and stagnant water thick in the air. We stepped inside. Luis pulled the door shut behind us, plunging us into total darkness. I flicked on a small pen light we had smuggled from the workshop, the beams slicing through the shadows. The tunnel stretched ahead, a relic of an older prison system, long forgotten by everyone but us. Then we heard it. Footsteps, not from behind us. Ahead, someone else was in the tunnel, and they weren't supposed to be here. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. Not a rat, not dripping water. A person. My breath locked in my throat as I killed the light. The tunnel plunged into absolute blackness. My ears strained, counting the steps, trying to tell how far ahead they were. Luis and Darnell pressed themselves against the damp concrete wall beside me, holding their breath. Who the hell else would be down here? This tunnel wasn't part of the prison's regular infrastructure. It had been sealed off decades ago. No guard patrols. No maintenance chicks. No cameras. Whoever was in here wasn't supposed to be. Just like us. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. For 5 long seconds, nothing moved. Then a flashlight clicked on. The beam sliced through the dark just ahead of us, bouncing off the damp walls. It was coming from around the bend, maybe 20 feet ahead. Close. Too close. Darnell grabbed my arm, voice barely above a whisper. What the hell is this? I didn't have an answer. Then the light shifted, moved lower, flickering along the wet ground. It wasn't a searchlight. They weren't looking for us. They were looking for something else. I took a slow, careful step forward, my heart hammering in my chest. Luis grabbed my sleeve. Wait. I shook him off. If we turned back now, we were done. The guards were probably already getting the power back up, and if we hesitated too long, we'd be trapped in here with nowhere to go. Another step, then another. Then the light snapped off. A shuffle of movement. Then nothing. Whoever they were, they had heard us. A voice echoed from the darkness. Low, calm, controlled. I don't know who you are, but if you take one more step, you're dead. For a second, I thought maybe we had run into another escape crew. But something about the voice didn't sit right. It wasn't panicked. It wasn't desperate. It wasn't like ours, the voice of men running for their lives. It was too steady. I glanced at Luis. His fists were clenched, his breathing tight. Darnell had shifted behind me, probably reaching for the makeshift blade he had strapped to his waistband. I forced my voice to stay even. We don't want trouble. Silence. Then a chuckle. That's good, 'cause you don't know the kind of trouble you just walked into. That was when I smelled it. Acrid. Chemical. Thick in the air. Burning plastic. The pieces snapped together all at once. Whoever was in here wasn't escaping. They were cooking meth. And we had just walked into their lab. The tunnel wasn't abandoned. Not completely. Somewhere in the depths of Redwood Penitentiary, in this forgotten part of the prison's infrastructure, someone had set up an operation. Maybe it was an inside job. Maybe it was an outside crew using a tunnel no one knew about. It didn't matter. What mattered was that we had stumbled into it. And now, we were a problem that needed to be dealt with. The darkness was pressing in around us, but I could hear movement ahead. More than one person. They weren't retreating. They were getting into position. I clenched my jaw. If we didn't act now, we wouldn't be escaping. We'd be buried here. I turned my head slightly toward Luis. Get ready. Then I reached into my pocket, found the metal wrench I had stolen from the workshop weeks ago, gripped it tight, and charged. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I just moved. The tunnel was pitch black, but I knew where the voice had come from. I heard the shuffle of boots, the sharp intake of breath. Whoever was down here wasn't expecting me to rush them. I swung the wrench in a wide arc. It connected with a sickening crunch against flesh and bone. A grunt of pain followed, then the thud of a body hitting the damp concrete. Then chaos. A gunshot exploded in the tunnel. The muzzle flash illuminated the space for a split second. 3 figures ahead, one crumpled on the floor, the other 2 reaching for weapons. I dropped low, my ears ringing, the shot deafening in the tight quarters. The bullet ricocheted off the wall, sending sparks into the dark. Luis was already moving, a blur of muscle and fury. He slammed into the second guy, forcing him back against the tunnel wall. They struggled, limbs tangled in the confined space, grunting, snarling. Darnell wasn't far behind. He went straight for the third man, the one with the gun. The tunnel erupted into a brutal, silent war. I scrambled forward, grabbing the man I had taken down. He was gasping, blood dripping from his mouth, but his hand was still working, reaching for something. I saw the gleam of a blade. I grabbed his wrist, twisted. He screamed. I twisted harder. The knife clattered to the ground. A second gunshot. I flinched, half expecting pain, but it wasn't for me. The guy Luis had tackled had fired wild, the shot going straight up into the ceiling. We couldn't keep this up. The noise was too much. If the guards hadn't heard us yet, they would soon. I made a choice. I grabbed the fallen knife, and I drove it into his side. The man gasped, his body jerking. He shuddered, twitched. Then he went still. I barely had time to register it before I turned to see Luis slam his opponent's head against the concrete. Once, twice, 3 times, until he stopped moving. Darnell had gone for the gunman's throat. His fingers were wrapped tight around his windpipe, his body pressing him down against the floor. The man struggled, but Darnell just held on, his face blank, cold, his grip never loosening. The gun slipped from the man's fingers. Luis grabbed it, turned it toward the last conscious survivor. A tense silence filled the tunnel. The only sound was heavy breathing and the distant drip of water. The last guy still alive coughed, a rattling, wet sound. His hands twitched at his sides. I knelt next to him, yanked him up by his collar. "Who the hell are you?" He just stared at me, dazed, blood trickling from his temple. "You shouldn't be here." I shook him. "Who set this up? Who's running this?" A small, pained grin crept across his face. "You think this is your problem? You have no idea what's coming." His eyes rolled back. His body slumped. Dead. No time to think about it. No time to dwell on the weight in my chest. We needed to move. I turned to Luis and Darnell. "We take the gun. We take whatever supplies they had. Then we finish this." Luis nodded, checking the gun's magazine. 2 bullets left. Darnell wiped his hands on his pants. His jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. But he didn't say a word. We moved past the bodies, deeper into the tunnel. No more hesitation. No more waiting. This escape wasn't just about freedom anymore. Something bigger was happening, and we had just stepped into the middle of it. We ran. The tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and suffocating, our footsteps splashing through puddles of stagnant water. The stench of mold and sweat clung to the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood still smeared across my hands. But I couldn't think about that now. We were too deep in this. The shootout had burned precious time. If the guards hadn't heard the gunfire, someone in the prison damn sure knew something was wrong by now. They would come looking. The only question was how soon. Luis led the way, gripping the pistol tight in one hand, his head on a swivel. I followed close behind, still clutching the stolen knife, my heart hammering. Darnell brought up the rear, silent, eyes darting back over his shoulder every few seconds. We had no idea if there were more of them, more men running the meth operation we had just stumbled into. But there was no time to search, no time to worry about who they worked for. The only thing that mattered now was getting out. The tunnel sloped downward again, curving slightly. Ahead, the air grew thicker, damp with something different. Then I heard it, the rush of water. Luis glanced back at me. "This is it." We reached the end of the passage, where the tunnel opened into a drainage culvert, the final barrier between us and the outside world. A large metal grate blocked the exit, rusted from decades of neglect but still holding firm. Water gushed through the bottom, spilling out into what I knew had to be a runoff channel just outside the prison's perimeter. Luis moved first, grabbing the bars, testing their strength. He cursed under his breath. "This thing is solid." I pushed past him, running my hand along the metal. I could feel the rust weakening the bolts, but it wouldn't come loose with brute force alone. Darnell looked around, frantic. "They're gonna find the body soon, man. We need to move." Luis raised the pistol. "We shoot the lock off." "No," I stopped him. "Too much noise. We need to pry it loose." Luis hesitated, then cursed again. He slung the pistol into his waistband and stepped back. "Then we do it fast." I searched the ground. The men from the tunnel had been carrying a crowbar, which now lay half submerged in the water. I grabbed it, wedged the tip into the weakest point of the grate, and heaved. The metal groaned, resisted, then shifted slightly. Luis and Darnell rushed in to help. Together, we threw our weight against it, muscles straining, sweat mixing with the filth on our skin. Then, with a screech of metal, the bolts snapped. The grate lurched forward, barely hanging on. One more push, and a voice from behind us. "Stop! Right there!" A flashlight beam snapped on, cutting through the darkness. A guard. He had a shotgun leveled at us, his stance wide, his finger hovering over the trigger. His uniform was soaked from the rain, his expression tight with shock. He must have come down here to investigate the gunshots. Bad timing for us. "Hands up, all of you." No one moved. The storm outside rumbled, thunder rolling over the hills. The only thing louder was my own heartbeat. Luis still had the pistol. 2 bullets. But a shotgun? 1 shot, and this escape was over. I looked at the guard, reading him. Young. Early 30s. Nervous. His grip wasn't steady. He hadn't expected to find us down here. We still had a chance. I raised my hand slightly. "Listen, Mun, you don't want to do this." His flashlight flickered over the blood on my hands. I saw his throat bob as he swallowed. You killed those guys." I shook my head. "You don't understand. We just wanted to get out. We didn't come here looking for trouble." His stance wavered. Luis shifted slightly beside me, the pistol still hidden at his side. If he went for the shot, it would be a gamble, one we probably wouldn't win. I had to keep him talking. "What's your name?" I asked. The guard's eyes flickered, a crack in his focus. "Shut up. Hands up. Now." Darnell's voice low. "Madek. Do it now." I acted on instinct. I lunged. The guard hesitated just a fraction of a second. Too long. I grabbed the shotgun barrel and yanked it sideways. The blast went wide, shattering the concrete wall, sending debris flying. Luis moved instantly, raising the pistol. 1 shot. The guard grunted, his body jerking back. The shotgun slipped from his grasp as he crumpled to the ground, gasping, his hands clutching his side. Not dead, but down. Darnell grabbed the gun, tossing it into the water. No time to check if the guard would make it. I turned back to the grate, adrenaline pounding in my skull. "Push! Now!" We threw ourselves against it one last time. The final bolts snapped. The metal groaned, and then it ripped free. Beyond the opening, the storm raged. Rain lashed against the concrete channel. The outside world. I didn't think. I ran. Luis followed. Darnell was right behind him. We splashed through the floodwater, slipping, scrambling forward. Behind us, the prison alarms began to scream. The escape had been discovered. Lights flickered beyond the trees, searchlights scanning the storm, trying to spot us. But the forest was ahead, and we had a head start. We climbed the embankment, our bodies shaking, the cold biting into our skin. The guards would be flooding out of the prison by now, sweeping the area, locking down the perimeter. But we were gone, disappearing into the woods, into the storm, into freedom, or whatever waited for us on the other side.